Deep within the perpetual darkness of the 41st millennium, where war is the only constant and mercy is a forgotten virtue, there exists a Space Marine chapter whose zealotry burns brighter and hotter than almost any other. These are the Black Templars, warriors clad in midnight armour adorned with Templar crosses, their righteous fury unmatched across the Imperium. For 10,000 years they have waged an eternal crusade, never resting, never relenting in their hunt for the Emperor's enemies. But here's the thing about zealots. When you believe with absolute certainty that your cause is righteous, when you're convinced that the Emperor himself guides your blade, when hatred becomes not a sin but the highest virtue, well, the lines between heroism and horror begin to blur. And for the Black Templars, those lines have been crossed so many times that they've become little more than distant memories, faded marks on a blood-soaked map of conquest that spans the entire galaxy. Today we're going to explore the dark underbelly of the Imperium's most fanatical chapter. We're going to examine the atrocities, the war crimes, the moments of such stunning brutality that even in a universe as grimdark as Warhammer 40,000, they stand out as particularly damning. Because while every faction in this setting has blood on their hands, while the Imperium itself is built on mountains of corpses and oceans of suffering, the Black Templars have distinguished themselves in ways that should give even the most hardened Imperial citizen pause. We're talking about a chapter that massacres innocent civilians in the name of purity. A chapter that operates flagrantly outside Imperial law, maintaining numbers that dwarf what the Codex Astartes permits. A chapter whose hatred of psykers is so absolute that they'll butcher sanctioned servants of the Imperium without hesitation. And perhaps most damningly, a chapter that has turned on their own brothers, murdering fellow Space Marines and even killing one of the Emperor's own custodians, simply because those warriors didn't match their narrow vision of what the Imperium should be. The Black Templars were born in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, during that tumultuous period known as the Second Founding. Their founder was Sigismund, the first captain of the Imperial Fists Legion, a warrior who had served as the Emperor's champion during the Siege of Terra. Sigismund was a man of absolute conviction, his faith in the Emperor unshakable, his hatred for traitors and heretics burned into his very soul during those dark days when Horus nearly destroyed everything humanity had built. When Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, demanded that the Space Marine legions be broken down into smaller chapters to prevent any one individual from wielding the kind of power that Horus had commanded, not everyone was pleased. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists and Sigismund's gene father, initially resisted. The Imperial Fists had bled themselves nearly white defending Terra. They had proven their loyalty in the most absolute terms possible. Why should they be punished for their devotion? The disagreement grew so heated that the Imperial Navy actually opened fire on an Imperial Fist strike cruiser. Civil war loomed once again, threatening to tear apart the Imperium that had barely survived Horus's betrayal. It was only then that Dawn relented, agreeing to divide his legion. But Sigismund saw an opportunity in this division. He gathered the most zealous of his brothers, those who shared his burning faith, those who believed the Emperor was not merely a man but a god deserving of worship. These warriors took up black armour and white tabards, styling themselves after the crusading knights of ancient Terra, and they swore an oath that would define their chapter for the next 10 millennia. Sigismund vowed that his Black Templars would never rest. They would wage an eternal crusade against the enemies of the Emperor, proving their loyalty not through words but through an endless tide of violence visited upon traitors, aliens, and heretics. Every High Marshal who has succeeded Sigismund has renewed this oath. For 10,000 years the Black Templars have been crusading, scattered across the galaxy in multiple crusade fleets, each one prosecuting its own wars, each one adding to a legacy written in blood and fire. Now, before we dive into the specifics, we need to understand what makes the Black Templars different from other Space Marine chapters. They're not Codex compliant, which means they don't follow the organisational structure laid out by Guilliman in the Codex Astartes. They maintain no homeworld, instead living aboard their crusade fleets, establishing temporary chapter keeps on worlds they conquer. Their exact numbers are unknown, kept secret even from the Inquisition, though estimates place them at somewhere around 6,000 battle brothers, roughly 6 times larger than a standard chapter. They also worship the Emperor as a literal god, which is unusual for Space Marines. Most chapters acknowledge the Emperor as the pinnacle of humanity, as their creator and master, but they don't worship him as the mortal humans of the Imperium do. The Black Templars are different. To them, the Emperor is divine, and their crusade is a holy war in the truest sense. This religious fervour, combined with their sheer numbers and their complete rejection of psykers within their ranks, makes them one of the most dangerous forces in the Imperium. Dangerous to the Emperor's enemies, certainly, but dangerous to innocents as well. Let's start with one of the most damning incidents in the Black Templars' history, an event that perfectly encapsulates the horror that unfolds when absolute conviction meets zero restraint. The year was 812.M41, and the floating hive cities of Arilan found themselves in the grip of a psychic plague known as the Witch Curse. This wasn't some chaos corruption, at least not initially. It was a spontaneous awakening of latent psychic abilities across the population, a phenomenon that turned ordinary citizens into unwitting conduits for warp energy. Citizens who had possessed even the slightest psychic potential, people who had lived their entire lives as normal productive members of Imperial society, suddenly found their abilities blossoming into uncontrollable storms of etheric energy. The results were catastrophic. People died. Infrastructure collapsed. The orderly functioning of these floating cities descended into chaos as reality itself began to fray at the edges wherever these unfortunate psykers manifested their powers. The Black Templars, whose crusade had passed through the Aralan sector less than a year before, received word of this disaster and immediately turned their fleet around. Here's where things get dark. When the Black Templars arrived at these floating hive cities suspended in Aralan's gaseous atmosphere, they didn't come as liberators or saviours. They came as executioners. The Templars marshalled every gunship in their fleet and launched a massive assault on the hives. Stormwing squadrons slammed through the stained glass orbs that protected each district, shattering these protective barriers and disgorging squads of Black Templars into the streets. Their mission was simple: locate and exterminate every psyker within the hives. But here's the horror of it. The Black Templars didn't just hunt down the psykers who were actually causing problems, they cut down every citizen that stood in their path. Think about that for a moment. These were Imperial citizens, loyal servants of the Emperor, people who had done nothing wrong except have the misfortune to live in the same city as individuals whose psychic abilities had awakened, and the Black Templars butchered them. Not as collateral damage, not as unfortunate casualties of war, but deliberately, methodically, anyone who got between them and their targets. The lore specifically tells us that many of the bravest hivers united against these hate-fueled Adeptus Astartes. Imagine being an ordinary citizen, watching these armoured giants crash through your streets, killing your neighbours, your friends, your family, and deciding that you have to stand up to them. Imagine the courage that would take, knowing you're facing warriors who are essentially demigods, who can tear you apart with their bare hands. These weren't heretics, these weren't traitors, these were loyal Imperial citizens trying to protect their homes and loved ones from what they rightly saw as an unjust massacre. And how did the Black Templars respond to this resistance? They staged what the lore calls the bloody massacre of the Crimson Plaza. The details of what exactly happened there are left to our imagination, but the result was clear. After that massacre, the citizens of Aralan were too terrified to oppose the Space Marines any longer. The Black Templars were left to go about their persecutions unhindered, hunting down and killing psykers throughout the floating hives. Now, you might argue that the psykers were dangerous, that they needed to be dealt with before they could become true threats. And yes, untrained psykers are dangerous. They can become conduits for demons, they can lose control and kill people around them. They're a genuine threat. But here's the thing. The Imperium has sanctioned psykers. It has systems in place for dealing with these situations. Black ships roam the galaxy collecting psykers, either training those who are strong and stable enough to serve, or executing those who are too dangerous. There are procedures, protocols, ways to handle this that don't involve indiscriminately slaughtering anyone who gets in the way. But the Black Templars didn't care about procedures or protocols. They saw witches, and they saw citizens defending witches, and in their minds that made everyone guilty. The fact that these citizens were defending the psykers, not because they supported warp sorcery, but because they were defending their neighbours, their children, their loved ones, meant nothing. In the black and white worldview of the Templars, you were either with them or against them, and if you were against them, you died. This incident at Arilan reveals something fundamental about the Black Templars' philosophy. They claim to fight for the Emperor to protect humanity, but their actions suggest that they care less about protecting humans and more about enforcing their own rigid, uncompromising vision of purity. The people of Arilan weren't enemies of the Imperium. They were victims of a psychic plague, and many of them were simply trying to protect their communities from what they saw as an outside threat. But to the Black Templars, none of that mattered. All that mattered was their mission: destroy the witches. And if innocent people died in the process, well, that was simply the price of righteousness. The aftermath of Aralan is left unrecorded in the lore, but we can imagine it. Thousands dead, entire districts of the floating hives left devastated, families torn apart, communities shattered. And for what? To satisfy the Black Templars' obsessive hatred of psykers, to prove once again that they were the Emperor's most zealous servants, willing to do whatever it took to purge the witch from the Imperium. What makes this even more damning is that this wasn't an isolated incident. This is standard operating procedure for the Black Templars. Throughout their crusades, they've demonstrated time and again that they view collateral damage not as something to be minimised, but as something to be accepted, even embraced. If innocent people die during their campaigns, that's simply proof of how serious the threat must have been. If entire populations are caught between the Templars and their enemies, tough luck, should have chosen better. The Aralan Massacre brings us to a broader discussion of the Black Templars' treatment of psykers, which is arguably one of their most consistently terrible characteristics. The Black Templars possess no librarians, the psyker space marines that other chapters employ as force multipliers and tactical assets. Most chapters see their librarians as valuable resources, warriors who have undergone the most rigorous training and mental conditioning to ensure they can wield their psychic abilities safely and effectively in service to the Emperor. But the Black Templars will have none of it. They view all psykers with deep suspicion and hatred, seeing them as inherently tainted, as potential vectors for chaos corruption. Now, in the grim darkness of the far future, this isn't entirely unreasonable. Psykers are dangerous. They do pose a genuine threat if not properly trained and controlled. The warp is a hostile, malevolent dimension filled with entities that want nothing more than to break through into real space and consume humanity. Psykers are weak points in reality, places where that barrier is thinner, where corruption can seep through. But here's where the Black Templars take it too far. They don't just avoid using psykers in their own ranks. They actively persecute psykers throughout the Imperium, often killing sanctioned psykers who are serving the Emperor just as dutifully as the Templars themselves. Astropaths, those psychically gifted individuals who enable faster-than-light communication across the Imperium. Navigators, whose psychic abilities allow them to guide ships through the warp. These are not rogue witches practicing forbidden sorcery. These are officially sanctioned servants of the Imperium, their abilities controlled and directed in service to the Emperor's realm. The lore has changed over the years regarding how the Black Templars view these necessary psykers. Earlier sources suggested they held special reverence for astropaths and navigators, seeing them as holy disciples who had communed with the Emperor, or who could perceive the divine light of the Astronomicon. More recent sources paint a picture of deep mistrust, with these psykers being shackled and confined to their quarters aboard Black Templar vessels. tolerated only because they're absolutely necessary for the chapter's operations. But sanctioned psykers serving the Imperial Guard, or those working for the Inquisition, or librarians from other Space Marine chapters. The Black Templars have shown time and again that they view these individuals as abominations, as things to be destroyed. When the Black Templars serve in the Death Watch, that elite chamber where Space Marines from different chapters are brought together to fight Xenos threats, they're forced to work alongside librarians from other chapters, and it doesn't go well. The lore describes Black Templar Death Watch veterans carrying special ammunition for killing psykers, called Witch Seeker bolts. They watch their psychic allies with open hostility, ready to execute them at the first sign of corruption. One story tells of a Black Templar apothecary serving in a Death Watch kill team, alongside a Dark Angels librarian and a Space Wolves rune priest. The Black Templar openly despised both of them, visibly stroking his blade whenever they used their abilities. He and the Space Wolf even fought a duel at one point, with the Black Templar winning and presumably feeling very satisfied with himself. This might seem like just an amusing bit of inter-chapter rivalry, but think about what it really means. These warriors are supposed to be working together against the greatest threats to humanity. They're fighting Tyranids, Orcs, Dark Eldar, enemies that want to see all of humanity destroyed or enslaved. And the Black Templars can't even trust their own allies, because those allies happen to be psykers. They're so consumed by their hatred, so certain in their conviction that all psykers are inherently tainted, that they're willing to undermine the cohesion and effectiveness of their own teams. But perhaps the most damning aspect of the Black Templars' anti-psyker stance is what they do with their own recruits. When a Black Templar neophyte, one of the chapter's initiates who has undergone the transformation into a Space Marine, manifests psychic abilities, what happens to them? Most chapters would send that warrior to be trained as a librarian, to learn to control and direct their gifts in service to the chapter. The Black Templars? The lore strongly suggests they simply execute them. These are their own brothers, warriors who have already undergone the brutal process of becoming a Space Marine, who have already proven their loyalty and worth, who have already been implanted with the sacred gene seed of Rogel Dawn. And the Black Templars kill them simply for being born different, for having abilities they didn't ask for and can't control. Some sources suggest that instead of executing them, the Black Templars might hand them over to be taken by the Black Ships, the vessels that roam the Imperium collecting psykers. But this seems unlikely. The Black Templars are hardly known for their restraint when it comes to witches, and the idea that they would show mercy to a psyker in their midst, even one who is their own battle brother, strains credulity. What makes this even more hypocritical is that the Black Templars have no problem using psychic powers when it benefits them. Their navigators and astropaths are essential to their operations. They work alongside the Grey Knights, an entire chapter of psychic Space Marines, though this is probably because the Grey Knights have never had a single warrior fall to chaos, which even the zealous Black Templars have to respect. They benefit from the Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse powered by the Emperor, and 10,000 psykers who are burned out daily to keep it running. But when it comes to other psykers, even those serving the Emperor just as faithfully as they are, the Black Templars see only abominations that need to be destroyed. This isn't pragmatism. This isn't even really about protecting humanity from chaos. This is fanaticism, pure and simple. It's taking a reasonable concern and twisting it into an excuse for murder. The Black Templars justify this by pointing to the Emperor's decree at the Council of Nicaea, where he banned Astartes from using psychic powers. Of course, that decree was later reversed after the Horus Heresy proved how valuable librarians could be. Most chapters moved on. The Black Templars never did, clinging to an outdated edict as justification for their prejudice. And here's the truly insidious part. This hatred of psykers has led the Black Templars to develop their own methods of dealing with enemy psykers and psychic powers. They have stratagems and war gear specifically designed to counter psykers. The Witch Seeker bolts we mentioned, the Aurelian Shroud which can disrupt psychic powers, various litanies and prayers that can deny the witch. They've essentially built an entire tactical doctrine around their hatred, turning it into a weapon. On the tabletop, this makes them interesting to play. In the lore, it makes them murderous zealots who would rather see a useful tool destroyed than accept that maybe, just maybe, their rigid worldview might not account for every situation. Psykers are a fact of life in the 41st millennium. They're born randomly across the human population. The Imperium has developed systems for dealing with them safely. But the Black Templars reject all of that in favour of their own prejudice, and innocent people, loyal servants of the Emperor, die because of it. Now let's talk about something that might seem less viscerally horrifying than massacring civilians or persecuting psykers, but which is arguably just as damning in terms of what it says about the Black Templars' relationship with Imperial authority. The Black Templars openly, flagrantly violate the Codex Astartes limitations on chapter size, and not by a little bit, by a lot. The Codex Astartes was written by Roboute Guilliman in the wake of the Horus heresy specifically to prevent any one individual from commanding the kind of military force that could threaten the Imperium. The Space Marine legions were broken down into chapters of 1,000 battle brothers. This was meant to be an ironclad rule, a fundamental safeguard against another Horus. If no chapter master commanded more than 1,000 warriors, the thinking went, then no single individual could wield enough power to seriously threaten the Imperium's stability. Most chapters follow this rule. Some bend it a little, maintaining scout companies or training cadres that push their numbers slightly above 1,000. The Space Wolves are known to have more than their allotted number, possibly as many as 1,200 or so across their various great companies, but the Space Wolves at least have the excuse of being a first founding chapter whose Primarch is Leman Russ, one of the Emperor's own sons. They have political capital to burn. The Black Templars, they're estimated to number somewhere around 6,000 battle brothers. Some sources have placed them even higher. Only the High Marshal knows the true number, and he's not telling. This makes them nearly as large as some of the original Space Marine legions were after the terrible losses of the Horus heresy. They're one of only 3 chapters believed to so blatantly violate the Codex's size limitations, along with the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights. Now, the Grey Knights at least have an excuse. They're the chamber militant of the Order Malleus. They fight demons exclusively. They have a special dispensation from the Imperium's highest authorities. The Space Wolves, as mentioned, are a first founding chapter with immense political clout. But the Black Templars, they're a second founding chapter. They have no special dispensation. They just do whatever they want and dare anyone to stop them. The Black Templars defend this by pointing to a supposed loophole in the Codex Astartes. They claim that crusading chapters, those without a fixed homeworld who are constantly on campaign, are exempt from the size limitations because it's impossible to track their exact numbers when they're scattered across the galaxy. And there's some truth to this. The Black Templars are divided into multiple crusade fleets, each operating independently, each containing several fighting companies. At any given time, they might have 3 primary crusade fleets active, though there have been periods with as many as 14 known crusades operating simultaneously. But here's the thing. This loophole is almost certainly something the Black Templars invented to justify what they were already doing. Roboute Guilliman didn't write the Codex Astartes thinking, oh, but if a chapter is really spread out, then the rules don't apply. He wrote it specifically to prevent Space Marine commanders from amassing too much power. The fact that the Black Templars are scattered across multiple crusade fleets doesn't change the fundamental reality that they're still 6 times larger than they're supposed to be. And this matters. It matters because the Codex Astartes wasn't just some bureaucratic guideline. It was written in blood, in the aftermath of a civil war that nearly destroyed humanity. It was designed to prevent exactly the kind of power concentration that the Black Templars represent. Sure, they're loyal to the Emperor now, but Horus was loyal once too. The Space Marine legions that turned traitor weren't created to be traitors. They were corrupted, seduced, turned against everything they once believed in. The point of limiting chapter size isn't because the Imperium doesn't trust Space Marines. It's because the Imperium learned, through bitter experience, that even the most loyal warriors can fall. And when they fall, you don't want them commanding legion-sized forces, but the Black Templars apparently think they're above all that. They think their faith makes them incorruptible, that their zealotry is proof against chaos. And maybe they're right. Maybe the Black Templars will never turn traitor, will never become another Word-bearers or Alpha Legion. But they don't get to make that decision for the rest of the Imperium. They don't get to say, the rules don't apply to us, just because they really, really believe in the Emperor. That's not how the law works. That's not how order and stability are maintained. And the Black Templars' refusal to abide by these restrictions represents a fundamental contempt for imperial authority. The Inquisition knows about this, by the way. They keep a close eye on the Black Templars precisely because of their excessive numbers. But they can't do much about it, because the Black Templars are too powerful, too useful, and too well connected. They have friends in high places, including within the ecclesiarchy, which shares their religious fervour. They've fought alongside nearly every major imperial institution at some point over their 10,000-year history, building up a complex web of obligations and debts, so the Inquisition watches and worries, but doesn't act. And this gets to the heart of what makes this so problematic. The Black Templars aren't just breaking the rules, they're demonstrating that they consider themselves above the rules, that they answer to no authority except their own interpretation of the Emperor's will. When High Marshal Helbrecht meets with imperial officials or inquisitors requesting aid, he's under no legal obligation to help them. The Black Templars decide for themselves which wars they'll fight, which causes they'll champion, which enemies they'll pursue. They're essentially an army unto themselves, loyal to the Imperium in a general sense but beholden to no one. This kind of independence might seem admirable in a way. These are warriors who follow their own path, who let nothing stand between them and their eternal crusade. But it's also terrifying. Because what happens if the Black Templars ever do decide that their interpretation of the Emperor's will conflicts with the Imperium's official policy? What happens if they conclude that the High Lords of Terror have become corrupt, that the Inquisition needs to be purged, that some other major imperial institution has strayed from the true path? With 6,000 battle brothers, the Black Templars would represent one of the most dangerous threats the Imperium had faced in millennia. They have enough force to seriously threaten the stability of multiple sectors. They're not quite legion-sized, but they're getting there. And the whole point of the Codex Astartes was to make sure this exact scenario never happened. The Black Templars would argue that this fear is misplaced, that their loyalty is absolute, that they would never turn. Against the Imperium they fought to protect for 10,000 years, and they might even be right. But that's beside the point. The Codex Astartes wasn't created to control the loyal. It was created to limit the damage the disloyal could cause. By refusing to abide by these restrictions, the Black Templars are essentially saying, trust us, we're special, we're different. But Horus was special and different too. Fulgrim was the Emperor's friend. Magnus was trying to save his father. Loyalty alone isn't enough. Systems, checks, balances, these things exist for a reason. The Black Templars' refusal to accept them is a profound failing, one that makes them a potential threat regardless of their current intentions. Now we come to perhaps the most damning incident in the modern history of the Black Templars, an event so shocking that it nearly led to their censure by Roboute Guilliman himself. This is the story of the Angevin Crusade, and it involves the Black Templars doing something that should be unthinkable for Space Marines, murdering their own brothers. To understand what happened, we need to talk about Primaris Space Marines. These are enhanced Space Marines created by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl using genetic templates and techniques that date back to the Great Crusade. They're bigger, stronger, and more resilient than traditional Firstborn Space Marines. When Roboute Guilliman was resurrected during the Gathering Storm, one of his first acts was to unleash these Primaris Marines across the Imperium, reinforcing chapters that had been worn down by centuries of warfare and founding new chapters to help stem the tide of chaos following the opening of the Great Rift. Not every chapter was happy about this. Some saw the Primaris as an affront to tradition, as twisted creations that represented a dangerous deviation from the Emperor's original vision. Others worried about diluting their chapter's culture and identity by incorporating these new warriors. The Black Templars were actually relatively accepting of Primaris reinforcements, at least officially. High Marshal Helbrecht met with Guilliman personally and agreed to integrate Primaris Marines into the chapter's ranks, even promoting some of his sword brethren to martial rank so they could command new crusades made up of Primaris warriors. But not everyone in the chapter shared Helbrecht's pragmatism. And this brings us to Marshal Angevin and his crusade. Angevin initially supported Helbrecht's policy. He swore an oath of fealty to Roboute Guilliman and prepared to welcome Primaris reinforcements into his crusade. When a torchbearer fleet, one of the specialised task forces carrying Primaris Marines, and the technology to create more of them, rendezvoused with Angevin's crusade, it should have been a moment of celebration. Reinforcements had arrived. The crusade would be strengthened. The Emperor's work would continue, but that's not what happened. Instead, mutiny broke out. Custodian, Borthnoth and his followers, egged on by Chaplain Mortian, declared the Primaris Marines impure and heretical. They held a vote among the Crusade's leadership, and when that vote went against accepting the Primaris reinforcements, they didn't just refuse the new warriors, they slaughtered them. Think about what this means for a moment. These weren't traitor space marines, these weren't chaos cultists or Xenos infiltrators. These were loyal Primaris Marines who had been created specifically to reinforce the Black Templars, who bore the gene seed of Rogel Dawn, who wanted nothing more than to serve the chapter and the Emperor, and the Black Templars murdered them, all of them. But it gets worse. The Primaris Marines weren't travelling alone. They were accompanied by a Custodian, one of the Emperor's own personal guardians, warriors who had stood at his side during the unification of Terror and the Great Crusade. These are among the most elite warriors in the entire Imperium, gene-forged by the Emperor himself to be his bodyguards and champions. Killing a Custodian isn't just murder, it's nearly sacrilege. It's an affront to the Emperor himself, and the Black Templars killed him. They killed their own marshal too. Angevin, who had supported Helbrecht's policy and wanted to accept the Primaris reinforcements, was slain by his own subordinates. These warriors turned on their commander, murdered him, then systematically hunted down and killed every Primaris Marine and the accompanying Custodian. The fighting was brutal. The lore tells us that Castellan Borthnoth and his followers took severe damage in the process, which makes sense because Custodians don't go down easy. Primaris Marines are no pushovers either, but in the end the mutineers won. They killed everyone who had come to help them. Then they concocted a cover story. They claimed the Torchbearer fleet had never reached them. They said they had been ambushed instead, that Marshal Angevin had died heroically trying to save his crusade from enemies. It was a complete fabrication, a lie designed to cover up their crimes, and for a time, it worked. The mutinous crusade returned to Imperial service, fighting in campaigns like the Talidus War against Chaos Forces, conducting themselves as if nothing had happened. But Roboute Guilliman grew suspicious. A torchbearer fleet, accompanied by a Custodian, doesn't just disappear without a trace. So he dispatched another fleet under Sergeant Rasej Lucerne of the Imperial Fists line to discover what had really happened. Lucerne was a former priest who had been taken by agents of Belisarius Cael and transformed into a Primaris Marine, and he had been specifically chosen for this mission because of his strong faith in the Emperor. Guilliman also gave him a secret mission. If historian Fabian Guelfrain, who was accompanying the expedition, turned out to be a Chaos agent, Lucerne was to kill him. When Lucerne's expedition finally caught up with the remnants of the Angevin Crusade, they found just 14 Space Marines and a single vessel. Castellan Borthnoth was still in command, and he and his surviving followers maintained their story about the Torchbearer fleet never arriving. But eventually, the truth came out. the Crusade's remnants took part in the Battle of Srinagar against the Word-Bearers, and during the height of the fighting, Lucerne revealed to Chaplain Mortian that he knew what had really happened. Mortian tried to kill Lucerne to keep the secret, but he was struck down by Botho, a neophyte who was the last survivor of the original Angevin Crusade. Castellan Beorthnoth died in the same battle, and with them died the last of the mutineers who had murdered their own marshal, slaughtered Primaris reinforcements and killed a custodian. Lucerne made a decision then. He kept the truth to himself. All the guilty were dead. Revealing what had happened would accomplish nothing except causing more pain and division within the Black Templars chapter, so he let the secret remain buried, though he knew, and Guilliman presumably knew, what had really transpired. This incident is absolutely damning for several reasons. First, it shows that the Black Templars' zealotry can be turned inward, that their rigid, uncompromising worldview makes them dangerous even to their own allies and brothers. These weren't enemies. These were reinforcements sent by Guilliman himself, accompanied by a custodian who represented the Emperor's own authority. And the Black Templars murdered them because they didn't fit their narrow conception of what a Space Marine should be. Second, it demonstrates a willingness to lie and cover up their crimes. The Black Templars love to present themselves as paragons of honour and righteousness, as warriors who fight openly and honestly for the Emperor. But when confronted with their own sins, they lied. They fabricated a story, returned to Imperial service as if nothing had happened, and would have gotten away with it entirely if not for Guilliman's suspicions. Third, it shows how dangerous their hatred can become when mixed with their independence. These warriors held a vote and decided that their personal beliefs outweighed the direct commands of a resurrected Primarch and the reinforcements sent by the Emperor's own guardian. They decided they knew better than Guilliman what the Imperium needed. They decided their interpretation of purity was more important than unity, more important than brotherhood, more important than the explicit hierarchy of the Imperium. And fourth, perhaps most disturbingly, this wasn't an isolated incident of one or two extremists going rogue. The mutineers held a vote. Enough of the Crusade's leadership agreed with Beorthnoth's position that they could successfully carry out this massacre and maintain the cover-up. This wasn't a madman acting alone. This was a significant portion of an entire crusade deciding that murdering their reinforcements was preferable to accepting warriors who didn't match their standards. The fact that Guilliman chose to let this remain hidden is pragmatic but troubling. The Black Templars are too useful, too powerful, and the Imperium is in too much danger to risk a full accounting of their sins. But it means that within the chapter, there are warriors who know what happened, who participated in the cover-up, who saw their brothers commit fratricide and chose to remain silent. It means the Black Templars can get away with murder, even when the victims are their own brothers and a custodian, as long as they're useful enough to the Imperium. While we're discussing the Black Templars' tendency toward extreme solutions, we should talk about their relationship with Exterminatus, the process of destroying an entire world. Now, to be fair, ordering an Exterminatus is typically beyond even a Space Marine chapter master's authority. That kind of decision usually requires approval from the Inquisition or other high-ranking Imperial officials. But the Black Templars have shown a disturbing willingness to engage in what we might call overkill, taking situations that might have been resolved with less drastic measures and instead opting for total annihilation. The Vinculus Crusade provides a perfect example. In 800th Year M41, the Black Templars under Marshal Ludoldus fought alongside Inquisitor Vinculus of the Order Hereticus, and elements of the Adepta Sororitas to root out a chaos cult operating in the Pelaragon cluster. They trace these assassin cultists back to Pelaragon IV, a volcanic world with shifting tectonic plates and rivers of lava. After breaching the cult's fortress and killing its leader, a demon of Khorne possessed Inquisitor Vinculus and began slaughtering everyone in sight. Marshal Ludoldus, the Emperor's champion Ulricus, and Canoness Jasmine managed to defeat the demon, sending it back into the warp. The Imperial forces evacuated as the volcano began to collapse. But then Ludoldus made a decision. To ensure no trace of the demon and its cult remained, he ordered Pelargon IV bombarded from orbit, until the massive forces unleashed tore the planet's crust apart and buried it beneath an ocean of seething magma. Now, on one level this is understandable. Chaos corruption is insidious. It can linger in places, infecting future inhabitants, spreading like a disease through populations. Better to be safe than sorry, right? But there's a difference between being thorough and turning an entire planet into a lifeless ball of molten rock. Were there other settlements on Pelargon IV? Other people who had nothing to do with the cult? We don't know, because the lore doesn't say. But given that it was a full planet, not just a single fortress, it seems likely there were other inhabitants somewhere on that world, and the Black Templars destroyed it all. They didn't carefully scan for other population centres. They didn't evacuate civilians. They just bombarded the entire planet until its crust cracked open. It's the equivalent of burning down your entire house to kill a spider. Sure, you got the spider, but was it really worth losing the house? This pattern repeats throughout the Black Templars' history. When they crusade against an enemy, they do so with overwhelming force, often leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. Their crusade keeps, the fortifications they establish on conquered worlds, are as much about controlling the population as they are about staging future campaigns. They're watchers, looking for any sign of treachery, any hint of heresy, ready to respond with maximum force at the first provocation. The lore describes the Black Templars as being unwilling to rest until every enemy has been destroyed. That sounds noble until you think about what it means in practice. It means no quarter given, no mercy shown, no prisoners taken. When the Black Templars come for you, they come to annihilate you completely. And while that's appropriate when fighting chaos cultists or orc warbands or tyrannid swarms, it becomes problematic when applied to humans who might be redeemed, to populations who are being controlled by the enemy rather than willingly serving them, to situations where a surgical strike might accomplish the same goal with far less collateral damage. The Black Templars don't do surgical strikes. They do overwhelming assaults. They crash into their enemies like avalanche of ceramite and rage, pulverizing everything in their path. And again, in many situations this is exactly what's needed. The galaxy is a horrific place filled with genuine nightmares that can only be stopped through absolute force. But the Black Templars apply this same mentality to every situation, regardless of context, regardless of whether more measured responses might be more appropriate. The defence of Hellsreach during the Third War for Armageddon deserves special mention, not because it represents a particular atrocity, but because it perfectly encapsulates both the best and worst of the Black Templars. When Gaskul Mag Uruk Thrukka returned to Armageddon at the head of the largest orc war seen in living memory, High Marshal Helbrecht answered the call for aid with 3 full crusades of Black Templars. The fighting was brutal, spanning continents and costing millions of lives. Reclusiarch Merek Grimaldus was tasked by Helbrecht with defending Hive Hellsreach with just 100 Space Marines. This was essentially a suicide mission. Grimaldus knew it. His warriors knew it. But they went anyway, because that's what Black Templars do. They fight where they're told to fight. They hold the line they're told to hold, and they die if that's what's required. The defence of Hellsreach became legendary, with Grimaldus and his warriors holding out against overwhelming odds, fighting through the streets and rubble as the Hive City was slowly torn apart around them. In the end, Grimaldus was the only survivor. 100 Black Templars went into Hellsreach. 1 came out, and while this is presented in the lore as a heroic last stand, as proof of the Black Templars' unbreakable will and courage, there's something deeply disturbing about it when you step back and look at the bigger picture. Those 99 Space Marines who died in Hellsreach could have been deployed more strategically. They could have been rotated out before they were ground down to nothing. They could have been reinforced, but Helbrecht chose to leave Grimaldus in Hellsreach with minimal support, essentially writing off those 100 warriors as an acceptable sacrifice to buy time for the larger campaign. And Grimaldus accepted this without question, because to question would have been dishonourable. This is the Black Templars in microcosm. Courage beyond measure, devotion to duty that borders on the superhuman, a willingness to sacrifice everything in service to their cause, but also a rigid adherence to orders that prevents them from questioning whether those orders make sense, a culture that valorizes death over survival, and a leadership that seems perfectly willing to spend their warriors' lives like currency as long as the mission is accomplished. Compare this to the Ultramarines, who are pragmatic about losses. If a position can't be held, they retreat and regroup. If a mission is costing more than it's worth, they reassess. They value their warriors' lives not because they're afraid of death, but because they recognize that a living Space Marine can continue fighting, while a dead one cannot. The Black Templars don't think this way. To them, the only truly honourable end is death in service to the Emperor. Survival without victory is shameful. Retreat is unthinkable. And this means they take casualties that could have been avoided, sustain losses that other chapters would consider unconscionable. While not strictly an atrocity committed by the Black Templars, their relationship with the Celestial Lions chapter deserves mention because it highlights another troubling aspect of their character. The Celestial Lions were nearly annihilated during the Third War for Armageddon, not by orcs, but by what appears to have been a systematic campaign of assassination carried out by elements within the Inquisition. The Celestial Lions had spoken out against the Inquisition's tactics during the Khalidar Crusade, where they felt innocent Imperial citizens were being killed unnecessarily. In retaliation, it seems certain Inquisitors decided to teach them a lesson. During the Third War for Armageddon, the Lions were repeatedly sent into impossible situations, given false intelligence that led them into ambushes, and their leadership was systematically targeted by what appeared to be precision strikes, disguised as accidents or enemy action. By the time they realized what was happening, the Celestial Lions had been reduced to a handful of survivors. Reclusiarch Grimaldus discovered evidence of the conspiracy through a hololithic message from the Lions' death speaker Yulkara, who warned that they had been lied to about the Mannheim Gap, that they had been sent to Armageddon specifically to die. Grimaldus brought this information to High Marshal Helbrecht, who gave him permission to investigate. Here's where the Black Templars' actions become troubling. They knew a fellow Space Marine chapter was being systematically murdered by elements within the Inquisition. They had evidence of this conspiracy. And what did they do? They helped the survivors rebuild. They fought alongside the remaining Celestial Lions. They gave them a strike cruiser and sent specialists to help them recruit and train new battle brothers. But they didn't pursue justice. They didn't expose the conspiracy. They didn't demand accountability from the Inquisition. Now, to be fair, this is partly explained by pragmatism. The Black Templars couldn't afford to go to war with the Inquisition, especially not when Gazgakul was still out there and needed to be pursued. The evidence was circumstantial. Starting a conflict with one of the Imperium's most powerful institutions would have accomplished nothing except getting more people killed. But it's still troubling that the Black Templars essentially chose to let this conspiracy remain unexposed. What makes this particularly hypocritical is that the Black Templars are usually so quick to pursue their own brand of justice. When they see heresy or corruption, they don't hesitate. They don't weigh the political consequences, they just strike, cutting down anyone they deem impure. But when confronted with evidence that elements within the Inquisition had committed murder against a loyal Space Marine chapter, suddenly they're all about pragmatism and political calculation. This suggests that the Black Templars' vaunted righteousness is selective. They'll massacre civilians at Arilan without hesitation. They'll murder Primaris reinforcements in the Angevin Crusade. They'll persecute psykers throughout the Imperium. But when confronted with a conspiracy within the Inquisition, an institution that actually has the power to threaten them, suddenly they become very careful about avoiding conflict. It's the behaviour of bullies, really. Quick to violence against those weaker than themselves, those who can't effectively fight back. but careful and measured when dealing with those who might actually pose a threat. The Black Templars portray themselves as righteous warriors who fear nothing in their pursuit of the Emperor's enemies, but their handling of the Celestial Lion situation suggests they're perfectly capable of political calculation when it suits them. As we approach the end of this examination, it's worth stepping back and looking at the broader pattern that emerges from these incidents. The Black Templars have been crusading for 10,000 years. In that time, they've fought in countless campaigns, participated in innumerable battles, made decisions both large and small that have shaped the history of the Imperium, and throughout all of it, they've demonstrated a consistent pattern of behaviour that prioritises their own rigid interpretation of righteousness over more measured, thoughtful approaches. They've maintained numbers far in excess of what's permitted by the Codex Astartes, making them a potential threat to Imperial stability. They've persecuted psykers throughout the Imperium, including sanctioned servants who were loyally serving the Emperor. They've massacred civilians who got in the way of their hunts for witches. They've murdered their own brothers when those brothers didn't meet their standards of purity. They've destroyed entire worlds rather than take the risk that some taint might remain. They've chosen political expediency over justice when confronted with conspiracies against other chapters. The question becomes, are the Black Templars still heroes? Are they still the loyal servants of the Emperor they claim to be? Or have they become something else, something darker, religious zealots whose faith has metastasized into fanaticism, warriors whose devotion has curdled into cruelty? The answer, frustratingly, is probably both. This is Warhammer 40,000, a setting where there are no purely good factions, where everyone has blood on their hands, where the difference between a hero and a villain often comes down to whose perspective you're viewing events from. The Black Templars are fighting genuine threats. The enemies they face, chaos cults and orc warbands and tyrannid swarms and Dark Elder raiders, these are legitimate threats to humanity's survival. In many cases, the overwhelming force the Black Templars bring to bear is exactly what's needed. But that doesn't excuse the times when they've crossed the line. It doesn't make the massacre at Aralan acceptable. It doesn't justify the murder of Primaris Marines and a Custodian during the Angevin Crusade. It doesn't make their violations of the Codex Astartes any less problematic. The Black Templars are useful to the Imperium, certainly. They're effective warriors who have proven their worth time and again, but they're also dangerous, unpredictable, and prone to taking their zeal too far. The tragedy is that the Black Templars probably see themselves as completely righteous. They almost certainly believe that everything they've done has been justified, that their actions are necessary evils in service to a greater good. The citizens of Arilan who stood against them, corrupted by association with witches, the Primaris Marines they murdered, impure deviations from the Emperor's design, the Codex Astartes restrictions they violate, unnecessary limitations on their ability to serve the Emperor effectively. This is how fanaticism works. It creates a worldview where every action can be justified, where every atrocity can be explained away, where doubt and self-reflection are seen as weaknesses rather than necessities. The Black Templars are so convinced of their own righteousness that they've become blind to their own failings. They can't see that their rigid ideology has led them to commit acts that would be unthinkable for more measured chapters. They can't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, absolute certainty isn't always the best guide to moral action, and the Imperium lets them get away with it because they're useful. Because the galaxy is such a nightmarish place that sometimes you need fanatics. You need warriors who won't question orders, who won't hesitate, who will throw themselves into the fire without a second thought. The Black Templars provide that, but the cost is high, paid in the blood of innocents who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, paid in the lives of loyal servants who didn't meet the Templars' impossible standards of purity, paid in the potential instability represented by a chapter that refuses to be bound by the same rules as everyone else. As we close out this deep dive into the worst things the Black Templars have done, I want to leave you with a thought. The Black Templars are not uniquely evil in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Every faction commits atrocities. The Imperium as a whole is built on a foundation of oppression, genocide, and systematic cruelty. The Black Templars are in many ways just more honest about it. They don't pretend to be enlightened or civilized. They're crusaders, holy warriors fighting an eternal war for humanity's survival. And in the grim darkness of the far future, maybe that's what's needed. But needed doesn't mean good. The Black Templars represent what happens when faith becomes fanaticism, when devotion becomes cruelty, when the certainty of righteousness overrides all other considerations. They're a warning about what happens when we become so convinced of our own moral superiority that we stop questioning our actions, stop considering whether our methods match our stated goals, stop caring about the collateral damage we cause in pursuit of our ideals. The massacred civilians at Arilan, the murdered Primaris Marines, the sanctioned psykers persecuted throughout the Imperium, these aren't just acceptable casualties in a greater war. They're people who deserved better. They're tragedies that could have been avoided if the Black Templars were capable of showing restraint, of exercising judgment, of recognizing that not every situation requires maximum force and minimum mercy. But the Black Templars can't change. It's not in their nature. They are what they are: zealots, crusaders, fanatics who have been fighting for so long that they've forgotten why they started. Their eternal crusade has become self-justifying, a mission that continues simply because it's always continued. Because to stop would be to admit that maybe, possibly, some of what they've done over the past 10,000 years was wrong. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing about them. Not that they commit atrocities, but that they do so without doubt, without hesitation, without any apparent understanding that their actions might be problematic. They're true believers in the worst possible sense, and in a universe where belief shapes reality, where faith can literally power miracles and ward off demons, that makes them dangerous in ways that go beyond their martial prowess. So the next time you see those black-armoured warriors with their white tabards and Templar crosses, the next time you hear about a Black Templars crusade achieving some great victory for the Imperium, remember what that victory cost. Remember the innocents who died. Remember the brothers who were murdered. Remember that righteousness without wisdom is just cruelty with better marketing. The Black Templars are heroes of the Imperium. They've saved countless worlds and turned back invasions that would have consumed entire sectors. But they're also monsters who have committed acts of stunning brutality in service to their narrow, uncompromising vision of purity. Both of these things can be true at the same time, and in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, that's probably the most terrifying realization of all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of the Black Templars, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. We've got more Warhammer content coming, including looks at other chapters and factions and what makes them tick. Drop a comment below telling me what you think about the Black Templars. Are they justified in their actions? Are they heroes or villains? Or are they something more complicated than either? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no heroes, only survivors. Stay safe out there in the dark millennium.